If you had to guess which federal agency used this brochure to attract new recruits, what would it be? The FBI? The DEA? The U.S. Marshal's Office? No, this brochure is brought to you by the Environmental Protection Agency. What most people don't know, and we didn't either until we started looking into it, is that the EPA has its own armed police force of about 175 agents who track down environmental crimes. And when they arrive on the scene, they mean business.
An EPA task force of 21 agents descended on this plant. Moving throughout the factory floor and up in the sales office, they questioned employees. But their main target that day was the man who had taken what had been a burned-out building and transformed it into this $20 million business. His name is Jim Knott.
Knott's plant processes wire for lobster traps and prison fences. For 20 years, Knott's company had a clean record, was supported by environmental groups, and was even honored by the state of Massachusetts. That all changed when EPA agents arrived in the fall of '97.
The 21 agents who showed up at your mill, were they armed?
A number of them were armed.
Were their weapons out?
They were right visible on their hips, yes. They were automatic pistols in most cases.
Kim Riviera says she was on the phone to a customer when an agent approached her.
He said something to me. I didn't quite catch it, so I put my finger up to motion 1 minute, and then he became very loud and told me I had 5 minutes to get my shit out of my desk, or it was then government property.
And Kim Riviera wasn't the only employee who complained about the EPA's conduct.
And they had combat boots with pants rolled up, and it was, all I could think of was the TV show Cops.
It wasn't the whole team, but there were the majority of them that were very loud and abrupt.
The intimidation itself was enough to just make you do what they asked you to do. The guns just enforced it that, you know, well, if I don't do it, what are they going to do with these guns?
He's got a gun, I got a letter opener. I don't win.
All of this was because the EPA believed untreated acidic wastewater was flowing out of Knott's plant into a public sewer. To process wire in this plant, acid is used, but it's not the kind of acid you might be thinking of.
This is the acid. See my hand disappearing?
The EPA uses pH tests to determine if wastewater has too much acid. Under the Clean Water Act, the pH cannot be lower than 5. The wastewater at Knott's plant showed the pH was between 2 and 4, a clear violation. At least that's what the EPA claimed.
I couldn't understand it. How in the world could this possibly have happened? I mean, these people, they wouldn't lie.
On August 12, 1998, Jim Knott was criminally indicted for dumping wastewater with a low pH, and this is the penalty he faced.
$1.5 million.
Yeah.
6 years in jail.
Right.
That was really a possibility.
As far as the EPA was concerned, it was.
20 years ago, the EPA would have handled cases like Jim Knott's and Steve McNabb's differently. Back then, criminal investigators weren't armed. They couldn't even execute search warrants. But that all began to change in the mid-'80s.
It was due in part to this man. As the former chief prosecutor of environmental crimes at the Justice Department, Judson Starr helped the agents get the authority to carry weapons.
Why do they need guns?
Well, there is often situations that EPA's investigators will find themselves in. While I was at the Justice Department, investigators were often taken shots at while they were performing their duties.
Starr says EPA investigators were considered second-class citizens in law enforcement until they won the authority to carry weapons. By the early 90s, the EPA was using this brochure featuring an officer in a firing position to recruit new agents. Starr left the Justice Department. He's now a defense attorney representing those charged with environmental crimes. Though still a strong supporter of the EPA, this is what Starr now says about its criminal investigators.
There is a feeling that there is excessive behavior at times on the part of EPA agents and that it could be governed with a little more reason. Certainly there is continuing loud and clear criticism of the Justice Department and of EPA for the cases that it selects to bring.
It's a question of proportion.
It's a question of proportionality, the degree of harm, and the behavior. Yes, that's correct.
Jim Knott argues the EPA harmed him. He says he lost business, had bank loans threatened, and a financial warning placed on his company by Dun & Bradstreet. Still, Knott said his own tests showed he had broken no law, so he set out to try and prove his innocence. And the proof, he says, was right before his eyes in the EPA's own logbooks. Knott and his attorney began looking at the 2s and the 4s the EPA says showed he was breaking the law. But there was something about those numbers that made them suspicious. Knott hired David Grimes, a former top FBI handwriting analyst, to examine the logbooks.
There's obviously a change here in the numerals.
Using a magnifying machine, Grimes showed us a whole series of numbers that had been altered. For instance, the EPA says this is a 2, but clearly there is another number under it. And the same is true for this 4. In each case, it appears, and this is Jim Knott's argument, the original number was a 7. Remember, any number lower than a 5 is a violation.
Any doubt in your mind that this is an altered number?
It is an altered number.
But David Grimes never got to testify to that. Just days before Knott's trial was to begin, the U.S. Justice Department and the EPA, citing a lack of evidence, dropped the case. But Jim Knott wouldn't drop it. He went to court and, using a new federal law, accused the EPA and the Justice Department of harassing and humiliating him.
They started it. They send 21 people in here, many of them carrying guns. What am I supposed to do? Lay down and get stomped on?
Were you humiliated by the government?
I do not like to be called a criminal. I find it humiliating to be called, identified as a criminal.
This past July, a federal district court judge in a stinging decision ruled the government's case lacked credible evidence, that there was evidence numbers were altered, and that Knott and his employees were harassed by a virtual SWAT team that stormed the facility to conduct pH samplings. The EPA was ordered to reimburse Knott for attorney's fees and expenses. They appealed immediately. But 4 months later, Knott says, they offered to settle with one big condition.
And he said, now, we'd be willing to pay that money if you would be willing to void the judge's decision.
So the way they want to settle it is they want to erase the judge's ruling.
Correct.
You won't do that?
Of course not.
How unusual is Mr. Knott in that he fought as hard as he fought?
Well, there are other cases and other instances throughout the country of people like Mr. Knott fighting back. Mr. Knott saw it through. Mr. Knott had also the evidence on his side.
Mr. Knott seems to have provided a persuasive case, but the government lied.
That's correct. So it appears, and I'm not quibbling on words. It's more than appears. The judge found so.
Even so, the EPA still claims in court documents it has evidence that Jim Knott was polluting the environment and could still bring a case against him if it chose to. But today, the only case in court is the one brought by Jim Knott. He's suing the government for $16 million, claiming that's what his business lost as the result of the EPA's action.
Why not leave it there and say, I won? Don't go forward with any more litigation.
Oh, that's absolutely wrong. I think it would be a crime for me to stop. I think it would be a crime for me to walk away and allow those people to do to others what they attempted to do to me.
Citing the pending lawsuit by Jim Knott, the EPA and the Justice Department each has declined our repeated requests for an interview. In its latest court filing, the EPA denies that numbers were altered and says the armed raid on Jim Knott's plant was carried out according to protocol.